Starfinder hasn't had kobolds in it since launch, and unless you bought the Alien Species deck, you probably didn't know that kobolds were silently added to the game. So, let's talk about kobolds, how they were written into the world lore when it comes to Starfinder, and what you will need to know to play one for your next character. Some of you who did buy the Alien Species deck told me that I missed the kobolds and they should have been included in my furry version of Starfinder, and I wanted to do right by the kobolds. If this is your first time seeing me, my name's Nathaniel. I talk world lore around role-playing games. If that's something you're interested in, I would love to have you join me at the table. Following the gap, kobolds seem to be missing from the Pact Worlds history. But not just the Pact Worlds, they were also missing from all surrounding planets. Many had assumed that their disappearance was tied to that of the planet Golorion, which also went missing. Kobolds eventually did make a return not only to the Pact Worlds, but also to all surrounding systems. The main reason for the kobolds' re-emergence in Starfinder, we can thank the Witchwarpers for that. The early Witchwarpers and their rituals, they pulled technologies from other realities into this one. At first, it was just rudimentary technologies. It was obscure objects, things that nobody really knew how they functioned. And most of them didn't function because they weren't in their proper reality. They also accidentally brought hundreds of creatures into this reality. Reptilian beings who identified as that of kobolds. And when their features were compared to the early records of what kobolds were, they did appear to match. So basically, Witchwarpers are responsible for kobolds in this universe. And even to this day, the kobolds have an affinity for witch-warping practices. It's easier for them to adapt, to master, to learn the Witchwarper spells. It's theorized that the kobolds still have some connection to their other reality, and that's why magic is so strong with them. Now, the kobolds as a species are generally quite sure of themselves. They have a nearly unnatural self-confidence. They believe that they are offsprings of dragons and that they are somehow owed a draconic ancestry because of this. There have also been reports of kobolds spontaneously transforming into extraplanar worms. While this definitely is uncommon, it is recorded to have happened amongst high-level kobold witchwarpers. The kobolds in Starfinder, they look like they came out of a fantasy age, out of a fantasy setting, because they probably did. The implications of this are staggering. This means that there is a multiverse of Starfinder, which greatly expands an already greatly expanded universe. Essentially, the Starfinder setting just got infinite. Now, while the kobolds can exist within this reality, there are some drawbacks to them which we will talk about in just a moment. Let's first paint a picture of a kobold. What do they look like? They stand about 3 to 4 feet tall on average. Kobolds do come in a wide variety of colors. Their scales can be anything in the color spectrum. What is most common with the kobolds, though, typically follows the dragon colors: red, blue, green, black, white, and the metallic colors as well. What's interesting here is the fact that a kobold's scales, they can change color over time. They can develop a gradient to their scales. Some will even experience their scales turning an iridescent color. These are the most common recorded changes amongst the kobolds, and it essentially represents them growing older. Now, being a kobold isn't all just rainbows and pretty colors. Kobolds face some real problems trying to exist in a reality that isn't their own. One reason they are believed to be able to stay in this reality is their flesh gives off some kind of a magical radiation. It's just faint, but if you use detect magic on them, you would see a faint glow around them. As I said, this radiation is believed to be the anchor that holds them to this reality. This radiation can also affect the kobold itself. Sometimes this radiation acts for good. If a kobold was to ingest a poison, or if they were to get a disease, sometimes this radiation will just block its effects entirely. Sometimes it works against the kobold, and they will just get random bouts of vertigo or food poisoning from foods they would otherwise normally enjoy eating. And it's also been recorded that when a kobold gets stressed out, their magical nature can lash out. When this happens, uncontrolled magic just erupts from the kobold. Sometimes this can take the form of explosions in the more severe cases. Other times you'll just see bright lights or lights flicker. Sometimes the kobold just loses phase with this reality and they become incorporeal. There has also been instances where a extraplanar gateway has opened up, which is kind of dangerous. And while the explosions, the extraplanar gateways, or even just turning incorporeal are very rare, they have only been known to happen a couple of times in a kobold's lifespan. Many kobolds can feel these events percolating or brewing within them before they happen, and can usually stop them through forms of meditation, magical pharmaceuticals. Others will just lean into these magical outbursts, using them to further fuel their magical studies. The first places that kobolds appeared already had strong dragon influence or draconic influence, but the most notable places with the biggest kobold populations are Absalom Station, Versailles, and Octurne. Some spaces in Absalom Station even adapted magically, apparently magically, overnight to accommodate the living spaces for these new kobolds, these new arrivals. And the kobolds that live here, they have adapted very well to living in space, to being on the space station. They are typically found in mechanical or engineering roles, as well as working and maintaining the Starstone energy grid. On Versailles, entire enclaves of kobolds just manifested. And while many of these communities still exist on Versailles, many of the kobolds here have taken to space and gone off on grand adventures. One of the most famous districts for the kobolds is the Razaz district. This can be found in the Fulbright township on the edge of Athalo. What this area is famous for is the kobold whiskeys that they brew. Reza scale whiskey became extremely popular throughout the Pact Worlds, and it is only brewed, it is only created in this area. This region is also famously known for kobolds wishing to explore their draconic transformation. Now, in case I didn't make this clear, when kobolds say they come from dragon history, from draconic origins, they absolutely desire to turn into a giant hulking dragon. And this belief is so strong, some kobolds actually can achieve this dream. Another place that was popular with the kobolds, where they generally were drawn to, and that would be the obvious choice of Triaxis, the homeworld of dragons. This planet was basically like a beacon for all the kobolds, and large kobold populations sprung up here. The kobolds adapted easily to life on Triaxis, admiring the dragons as well as the dragonkin. So what is it that actually drives a kobold? Is it money? Is it power? Is it wine, women, and song? In most cases, it is actually ambition. This ambition is born out of the inner desire of the kobolds. They know something isn't quite right with them. They don't totally belong in this reality. But instead of losing sight of who they are, becoming consumed that they don't belong here, what this ends up manifesting into is something entirely different. Even though a kobold knows internally that they don't necessarily belong in this reality, what they're able to do instead is harness this inner conflict. Sometimes a kobold can start a business which will eventually turn into a massive empire. Other times, they might find a solution to a complicated technological problem. With them being just slightly out of sync with this reality, this causes them to perceive things that could be not as they are. And this is what can give them an edge in invention, business, and even magical studies. Of the kobolds who believe they are destined for greatness, which is basically all of them, there are those who have achieved it, those who haven't achieved it, and those who have yet to achieve it. In the first group, those who have achieved their greatness, achieved their success, typically they are quite narcissistic, and they have a generally overinflated ego. These traits aren't desirable, but they are commonly associated with those in positions of power, specifically with the kobolds. Those who have failed to achieve greatness, are trying to achieve greatness, commonly struggle with anxiety and depression. They know that they are supposed to be fulfilling a need within themselves to be something greater than they are. And it's this disassociation of self which really causes the internal struggle, the internal conflict for a kobold. Something else that is a common struggle for kobolds is their size. They believe that they are descendant of dragons, yet they are 3 to 4 feet tall. They really struggle with being so short. Now, if you've decided that the kobold is the right species for you, here are a few things you need to know before creating your character. Your ability score adjustments will be +2 dexterity, +2 charisma, and -2 constitution. Constitution will likely be your kobold's biggest weakness because as a small creature, you're not going to get a lot of hit points, coming in at 2 hit points. As I've said, the kobold is short, so you will have a small size. Now, the kobold's scales are not just aesthetic, they do provide some armor value. And as a kobold, your scales will provide +1 AC. That is not a mistake, that just means you get +1 added to your EAC and to your KAC. Now, because the kobolds are so perceptive, they are so adaptive, they do gain a +2 species bonus to engineering, perception, as well as physical science checks. Kobolds also have dark vision with a range of 60 feet. The last thing you will need to consider when you are creating your kobold is the color of their scales. Depending on their color and which dragon it's associated with, they will also gain damage resistances to specific elements. Acid resistance, fire resistance, cold resistance, and electrical resistance. Now, if you'd like to see a good rundown of some uncommon races, I suggest this video for you here. Thank you to all of my patrons for supporting me and the channel. My name's Nathaniel. Thanks for stopping by, everyone.